Okay, we're now going to do an overview of the upper limb and talk about the osteology and answer the what questions. What are the bones and bony landmarks of the upper limb? Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Morton, and let's get started. So the bones of the upper limb are listed here as follows, and the purpose of these bones is that they provide a framework to which muscles, tendons, and ligaments of the upper limb attach. So let's take each each bone one by one and talk about them. So first is the clavicle, also known as your collarbone. Now, the clavicle is the only bone that connects the upper limb to the trunk. All other attachments of the upper limb to the trunk are muscular or ligamentous. And the collarbone is shaped like an S. So if we see this superior view of the right clavicle, look, it has this S shape to it. Now, it has two ends, the acromial end that articulates with the acromion of the scapula, and then the sternal end that articulates with the manubrium of the sternum. That makes sense. Now the next bone is the scapula, also known as your shoulder blade because it looks like a little shovel blade. Now, the scapula we're going to look at is in this anterior view of the right scapula and posterior view of the right scapula and talk about individual structures. So first one is called the subscapular fossa, and that is located here in the anterior portion of the scapula, and outlined shows the subscapular fossa, which serves as an attachment for the subscapularis muscle, one of our rotator cuff, and that is also the surface that slides or glides on the rib cage. Next is the acromion, which means point of the shoulder, and this is what articulates with the lateral portion of the clavicle, or acromial end of the clavicle. Here we have the spine of the scapula, which is on the posterior portion, a very palpable landmark in surface anatomy. It also serves as the attachment for the trapezius and deltoid muscles, and then it serves as a landmark to certain fossae. So here's the spine, and the fossa above the spine of the scapula is appropriately called the supraspinous fossa, origin of the supraspinatus muscle, another rotator cuff. The fossa below is called the infraspinous fossa, or the fossa below the spine, and that's the region for the attachment of the infraspinatus muscle, another rotator cuff. So here we have laterally the glenoid cavity, also known as the glenoid fossa, and this is the socket of the ball and socket joint, or of your glenohumeral shoulder joint. Above it, there's a little tubercle or bump called the supraglenoid tubercle, for being above a tubercle or bump above the glenoid cavity, and that's the attachment of the long head of the biceps brachii. And then another bump, a tubercle below, called the infraglenoid tubercle, that's the attachment for our long head of the triceps brachii muscle. Here's our coracoid process, which means a beak-like projection, and that's a very palpable landmark in surface anatomy, and it serves as an attachment for our pec minor, short head of the biceps, and the coracobrachialis muscles. All right, there's our scapula. Now let's talk about the humerus. So there's an anterior view of the right humerus and a posterior view of the right humerus, and this is the principal bone of the arm. And the proximal landmark is called the head because it's at the very top. It's round, looks like a head, and that's what serves as the ball portion of the ball and socket joint of the glenohumeral joint. That's what articulates with the glenoid fossa. Here is the anatomical neck, which is the neck, the portion below the head. And if there's also a surgical neck, this is where the axillary artery and our circumflex humeral vessel arteries course. And this is, if fractured, can injure that nerve, the axillary nerve, and it's more commonly fractured than the anatomical neck. We have this very large bumper swelling on the side and the lateral portion of the proximal humerus called the greater tubercle. It's what serves as an attachment for the joint capsule and also our supra and infraspinatus muscles and teres minor. There's a smaller bump in the proximal and anterior portion of the humerus called the lesser tubercle. This is what serves as an insertion for the subscapularis muscle. Now, between our greater and lesser tubercle, there is a groove. So they call it the intertubercular groove, also known as the bicipital groove because the long head of the biceps tendon courses through that. All right, now on the posterior portion of the diaphysis of the humerus is something called the radial groove. It's called the radial groove because the radial nerve courses through it. It's called the spiral nerve because it makes a spiral shape as well. If fractured in this region, in this middle diaphysis, the radial nerve is often injured. Now, on the lateral portion of the humerus, there's this bump called the deltoid tuberosity. I'm pointing there, but in this illustration, I don't see it, but that's where the deltoid inserts. Now, there's the lateral epicondyle, which is a common landmark on the lateral distal portion of the humerus, and it's the common origin for forearm extensor muscles. And then the medial epicondyle, a very prominent surface anatomical landmark, and that's the common attachment for our forearm flexors. Our trochlea, the word trochlea means pulley, is one of the articular surfaces for our hinge joint that articulates with the olecranon fossa of the ulna. And then laterally there's the capitulum. It gets its name because it looks like a head. That's what articulates with the head of the radius. Then there's the coronoid fossa, this little concave surface on the anterior distal surface of the humerus, and it articulates with the coronoid process of the ulna. And then on the back is a larger fossa called the olecranon fossa, and that's what serves as a landmark where the olecranon process goes into during extension. All right, now let's talk about the radius, which is one of the two bones in the forearm, and it's the lateral bone, and it's the bone that pivots during pronation and supination. And then the radius has the following principal landmarks. The head is the most proximal portion. That's what pivots during pronation and supination. The radial tuberosity is a bumper swelling in the proximal radius, and that's where the insertion for our biceps brachii tendon is. And then distally, there's the radial styloid process that is a landmark for an attachment of the brachioradialis muscle. Now, the other bone in the forearm is the ulna, and it's the medial of the two. Now, the ulna has the following landmark. The olecranon process, which is the proximal process that during extension moves into the olecranon fossa of the humerus. And then there's the coronoid process, which is the process that during flexion goes into the coronoid fossa of the humerus. And between the two is the trochlear notch that articulates with the trochlea of the humerus that makes our hinge joint. Distally, we have the ulnar head, a bumper swelling, and distal to that is a pointy thing called the ulnar styloid process. All right, so now let's talk about the hand bones. So there's our hand bones. So let's zoom in on that. We're composed of three parts: carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So for our carpal bones, there are these 8 bones. There, one, the pisiform, this P-shaped bone where it's in the tendon of the flexor carpi ulnaris. Deep to that is the triquetrum, and then there's the lunate that gets its name because it looks like a half-shaped moon, and then there's the scaphoid, the most commonly fractured carpal bone. It's also located deep in the anatomical snuff box. There's also the trapezium that articulates with the metacarpal of the thumb. I think of trapezium and thumb. And then adjacent that is the trapezoid bone. Adjacent that's the capitate. And then there's the hamate bone. So of these 8 bones, if we put this line between them, there are 4 carpals in a proximal row and 4 carpals in a distal row. The metacarpals, that prefix meta means at the end of the carpals. And there's 5 of them. Number 1, the first metacarpal is what's articulating with the bones of your thumb. The second is the metacarpal of articulating with your index finger, middle finger, ring finger, and pinky. There's our metacarpals, and these bones form the palm of the hand. Now, the phalanges, also known as your digits or fingers, are as follows. They are 1, the phalange of your thumb, 2, index finger, 3, swear finger, middle finger. Let me say that again. Your third is it's the swear finger, but it's also your middle finger. Then you've got your 4, which is your ring finger, and 5, which is your pinky. And so there's 3 bones in digits 2 through 5, the proximal, middle, and distal phalanx. But your thumb only has 2, so they call it proximal and distal. So there are all the bones of the hand labeled. So there, my friends, are all the bones of the upper limb in a nutshell.